As previously noted in the earlier slide, some Americans during the early national period, and this includes Southerners, right? Both Southerners and Northerners, actually hoped or even believed that slavery would die out naturally in our country, right, in the early 1800s. And this was in large measure spurred by some economic reasons, namely the southern agricultural industries were actually beginning to decline in profit. So consideration was made by some of the southern plantation elite, right, to perhaps pursue other avenues to attain wealth. But one key invention that was made in 1793 was the cotton gin. And the inventor, his name was Eli Whitney, basically found a way to make cotton more readily available as a commodity. Why? Because earlier, if you grew cotton, you discovered that it was hard to clean, to take the seeds out. It was too time consuming and labor intensive. But with this new invention, this machine that actually was able to clean cotton and take the seeds out, right? Well, it made cotton much more manageable in terms of production, and therefore you see production of those early cotton plantation owners really increase and profits begin to soar. All right, so by the early 1800s, you see cotton basically taking over as the primary agricultural product to sell on the market. All right. And again, this is southern cotton because these lands that cotton grew best in, right? The best arable land for cotton was indeed in the South. We know these areas like the Mississippi Delta, right? The deep South, like Mississippi and Alabama. Those were the places where you see these huge, sprawling cotton plantations before the Civil War. Okay, so in other words, slavery gained new life, is what happens, and you see the emergence of something called king cotton, which is the name for, or it actually symbolizes uh, the fact that cotton is much like gold, right? White gold. It ruled in the South and it takes over, like I said, other products like sugar as the world's major crop produced by slave labor. Okay, the most in demand product in international trade. So during the Jacksonian period, we talked about how Indians would be removed from the southern, let's call it the southeastern areas like Florida, but even places like Alabama, Mississippi, those Indian tribes who claimed that area as their ancestral homelands would be forcibly removed to the Oklahoma Territory. This is the Trail of Tears, under the Jackson administration. And why? You're making room for cotton. You're converting that soil from Indian soil to slave soil. All right, so by the 1830s, in fact, African slave labor would be the main driver of American wealth due to cotton. In fact, by 1836, almost half of America's wealth would be derived from cotton in the South. Right. So, in other words, southern cotton was sold, on the market not only domestically but, of course, globally, right, especially to Europe. And here is something to align with that earlier statistic about half our national wealth. It's important to note that the labor that produced half of this wealth, the hard labor, was indeed produced by only 6% of the population back then. And who's that? the southern slaves working in the plantation. So, slavery is not this feudal throwback that would eventually disappear, right? As some of the founding fathers actually believed. Actually, it's the opposite, right? It became to rule. It's King Cotton. Three-fourths of our cotton supply came from the South, all right? And when we think about the cumulative wealth on a national level that was gained from black slavery producing cotton, right? Not only does it account for half of our national wealth, but things like the northern industrialization effort, right? That would be partly financed by slave labor producing all this cotton. So, as a whole, our national economy, it should be noted, was benefiting from Southern slavery. Okay, so since cotton was the most important American export, right? And the whole nation, as I stated, economically benefited from slavery. Well, it goes on to shape the lives of really all Americans, not just in the South, not just blacks or whites, every American, right? Um, like I said, you see the rise of certain areas in United States and even in England, by the way, that are part of this, or actually accounted for by trade in Southern cotton, right? It helped to determine our national economy so much that it went on to affect what you could say non-economical aspects. For example, how Americans lived, how they worked, under what conditions Americans could exercise their freedom of speech, assembly, in other words, their liberties, right? The very conditions of life that you wouldn't expect to be affected by the cotton industry was indeed affected by it. Now, all we could do here is summarize, but there is some important work by historians that actually expose that to the consciousness of many, students and scholars about how ubiquitous slave labor and its product, how widespread and ubiquitous, excuse me, its effect was. Okay. And, even northern merchants, just to add more, they actually participated in the slave economy in more of an indirect, oblique way, if you will. Of course, they didn't own slaves, right? Um, they earned money in cotton trade, however, that helped finance the industrial development of the South and hence their businesses. And the South knew this. They knew there was this interconnection with the financial well being and therefore the livelihood, as we just discussed, of Americans in the North and other places. And this actually fed into their audacity to secede eventually, meaning to separate from the Union by 1861. Now, in most lectures, I would actually spend a lot of time on the nature of slavery, and we would openly discuss this, right, on the experiences that African American slaves had. It's obviously a very important chapter in our national history. But since students are writing about this based on the Douglass autobiography, what I'll do here is provide more of a glimpse of other aspects that you could tie in with Douglass's experience, and hence, arguably the experience of other African Americans ensnared in slavery. Right? You could extrapolate the fact that Douglass typified the typical slave experience. All right, so in the South, as we talked about, cotton is just booming. And of course, you see the end of task labor. Let's recall that distinction. Now it's all about gang labor, meaning you work from sunup to sundown on that plantation field. And, this is something that Douglas talks about. everyday life of the slave, right? It's marked by incessant toil and labor. And if you disobeyed, if you slacked, if you dragged your feet, if you feigned illness, you were subject to brutal punishment. In fact, even if you weren't feigning illness or lagging, you were still subject to brutal punishment. I recall a diary of a Southern slave owner who professed to be a ardent Christian, right? Who felt very guilty that he was a slave owner, that he owned slaves. But what did he do every day, according to his diary? Every day he whipped his slaves to make sure that they did not rebel and to ensure his profits, right? But, here's the reality. You're subject to brutal punishment because of reasons I just described. And not only that, this is something you'll write about, the constant fear that, the family, the African American family in the slave system would be destroyed, right? There would be family separation. For example, the sale of slaves, right? Sale of your mother, your father, your siblings. Why? Because, of course, slaves were, in the Southern mind, first and foremost property, not human beings. Okay, so this brings up this interesting um, Southern ideology because it shows a contradiction here. I just described African American slaves as being conceived as commodities, right? First and foremost, as commodities for sale in the market, just like cotton is a commodity, right? So too are people of African descent in the South. But it contradicts with this idea of paternalism, okay? And as we'll discuss, paternalism is one justification as to why the South defended their slaves, right? One reason why they defended their way of life. Okay, so what is paternalism? Paternalism was, again, this justification for Southern slavery. And as the word suggests, it suggests a father figure, right? Paternal, and even family formation. So here is how paternalism worked according to this ideology, that the plantation was an extended family, and that included the slaves, right? And you have the relation between the slave owners and the slave owners' family, right? In contrast to the slaves of this plantation. Now, in this relation between slave owner and slave, it could be characterized, according to paternalism, as a relation of mutual benefit. That's to say, they both gained from this relationship. So, how does this work? Well, it's obvious that in the case of the slave owners, they benefit from the labor, the free labor, right? Well, not to confuse you with free labor in the North, but sure they had to pay for their slavery at one point, their slave at one point, or perhaps on the slave market domestically, but they often got slaves from birth, right, of African Americans, sexual unions, right? Okay, so you have this source of quote free labor, and owners benefit from that labor. But according to paternalism, so too do slaves benefit in some way in this relation. Well, here's how the rationale worked out. First and foremost, it presupposed that persons of African descent, African Americans, Negroes to use their word back then, were inherently inferior, that they could not, if left to their own devices, so to say, survive out there in the world. Their survival necessitated the guidance and even, the provision of, their means of subsistence, right, in everyday life. I'm talking about food, shelter, and clothing, that the slaves were unable to attain on their own. Okay, how you have to think about this, in fact, is imagine Slave owners conceiving their slaves just like you would conceive a 6-year old child, right? This young child could not survive on their own without family, namely adult supervision, right? So, too, because of their supposed inferiority, um, did slaves or would slaves perish, right, without adult supervision, without the supervision of their slave owners, to be specific. So therefore, that's the relation of mutual gain here. You see the slaves, in principle, according to paternalism, able to obtain the basic necessities of life without the owner's benevolence. Supposedly, they would perish. Right. At the same time, you see um, slave owners gaining the benefit of labor. So the way they thought of this is, again, the plantation being one big family. And of course, the paternal figure here is the slave owner accompanied by his lady, right? It's very, especially in the large plantations, it's aristocratic, right? It's been characterized as, quote, quasi feudal, even though feudalism has died, right? Well, in our country, we never had it, right? But in parts of Europe, it's dying already. All right, so paternalism, again, is a primary justification for the ownership of slaves. And this links to other things that I hope you could connect in your paper, like, you know, how did Douglas argue that slaves were indeed not happy, right? According to paternalism, slaves are happy because they receive the benefits from the benevolent master, right? So, again, this ideology looms large as a way to justify slavery. But let's remember that's just the ideology, that's the belief system. Did it correspond to reality? And of course, the answer is no, right? In fact, when you think about these steps to improve the slaves' living conditions, they're actually done to strengthen slavery, not to undermine it, right? Slave owners are not thinking about providing with slaves out of the goodness of their heart. No, they want to ensure that their slaves have at least the basic necessities of life so they can do their work. So that's the reality of paternalism, right? Even as the material lives of most slaves improved, the South is drawing tighter and tighter the chains of bondage, right? They're not loosening the chains, right? And actually, it's interesting to note when you compare Southern slavery in our country with other parts, let's say Brazil, right, where it's one of the biggest slave societies in the New World. Um, Southern slaves actually enjoyed better material conditions, right, like their conditions of life, but they had less freedoms than Brazilian slaves, right? In Brazil, it was the opposite, right? They might not have had the basic necessities of life, but they actually had more freedom. So the question is what would you prefer if you were a slave, right? And that's not even a good choice to even be forced to deal with. Okay, so it's also important to remember this that even though it's a very, very small percentage, there were some free blacks in the South. Okay. But even in this case, there's a very tenuous boundary, a thin line between, being free and being a slave in the South. And Douglas even mentioned this, right? Sure, you could be free, a free black, if you will, but you still could not vote. You enjoyed very little economic opportunities. There's a lot of prohibitions against you, like you can't own firearms, you can't buy liquor, anything that's associated, by the way, with disrupting Southern order by African Americans, right? Things like you can't testify in court. You always had to carry this certificate of freedom with you at all times, all right? Just When you claim you're free, well, they're going to check that certificate, right? So, in other words, they're secondary citizens, and that's just the reality of it. So, I just mentioning the maintaining of order. This is so critical in the South during this time. It's a critical component in controlling slaves to make sure that they don't engage in rebellion, that they remain a tractable labor force, and therefore ensuring the profits, right, of these owners. So, this system in the South is really not based on, quote, rule of law, to use our term, but upon force and even violence, right? The masters usually had complete discretion in punishing their slaves, inflicting violence upon them. As Douglas explained, actually, even when slaves were completely innocent, they were given the lash, right? So, by the way, there were subtler means of control. Sure, there's paternalism, there's dividing and conquer and pitting the master slaves against each other, right? Field slaves versus the house slaves, right? And all these things were put into use as strategies or tactics to make sure the slaves don't unite together. And they worked for the most part. Okay, we'll move on to our next slide.